Hey there, history buffs. Did you know that everything you think you know about the medieval era might be totally wrong? From knights in shining armor to castles filled with dragons? Okay, maybe not dragons. Our understanding of the Middle Ages is clouded by myths and misconceptions. Ever wondered if people really believed the earth was flat back then? Or if knights truly followed a code of chivalry at all times? Well, you've come to the right place. In today's video, we're diving into the top 10 myths about the medieval period and uncovering the surprising truths behind them. So grab your chainmail or maybe just a comfy seat and let's debunk some medieval myths. But before we get started, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more myth-busting videos. Let's start with a big misconception, that people in the Middle Ages thought the earth was flat. It's easy to imagine folks peering over the edge of a pancake-shaped planet, right? But the truth is far less flat. Medieval scholars knew the earth was round. Educated people in Europe knew this since ancient Greece. Aristotle and Ptolemy figured out the earth was a sphere. Medieval scientists like Thomas Aquinas and John Sacrobosco used the spherical earth model. They calculated the earth's circumference with surprising accuracy. So where did the flat earth myth come from? It dates back to the 19th century. Historians like Washington Irving popularized the idea. It portrayed earlier eras as ignorant, paving the way for Columbus and the Renaissance. It's a good story, but it's not true. Now, let's talk hygiene. We often imagine medieval peasants as dirty, grimy people who never bathed. But in reality, cleanliness was more important than you might think. Public bathhouses were common in medieval towns, and we're not talking about some dingy, unsanitary hole in the ground. These were often social hubs, places to relax, chat, and, well, get clean. Bathing at home was also a regular practice for many. People used tubs, basins, even went for a dip in rivers and streams. Cleanliness was linked to health, and some medieval texts even recommended washing hands before meals and keeping bodies clean. It's true that bathing became less common during later centuries, particularly after the Black Death ravaged Europe. But in the early medieval period, they weren't as dirty as we like to think. Ah, the noble knight in shining armor, always rescuing damsels and fighting with honor, right? Well, like most things in history, the reality is a bit more complicated. While knights did have a code of chivalry, it wasn't always followed to the letter. It's kind of like New Year's resolutions. Great in theory, not always followed through in practice. The code encouraged knights to be brave, loyal, and protect the weak, all very admirable qualities. But in practice, many knights behaved more like warlords, plundering villages, seizing land, and engaging in some pretty brutal power struggles. Remember, these were times of conflict and upheaval, and a knight's life wasn't all jousting tournaments and romantic gestures. The concept of chivalry, as we often romanticize it, comes from much later medieval literature, like the stories of King Arthur and his Round Table. These tales emphasized the ideals of knighthood, but they were written centuries after the early medieval period. In truth, the medieval knight was a lot more complex than the heroic figure we see in movies. The shining armor, more often than not, was probably dented and mud-splattered. Think of a medieval castle and you might picture a cold, drafty stone fortress. You know, echoing hallways, flickering torches, maybe a ghost or two for good measure. But castles were actually designed to be as comfortable as possible for the time. Wealthy lords and ladies took great care in decorating their homes with tapestries, carpets, and other furnishings to keep warm and cozy. These weren't just bare stone walls. We're talking rich fabrics, intricate designs, and even family crests woven into the tapestries. Castles also had elaborate fireplaces, sometimes in every room to combat the chill. People used fur-lined clothing and heavy blankets to stay comfortable. It's true that heating a stone building wasn't easy, but medieval people were resourceful and certainly didn't live in discomfort all the time. Contrary to popular belief, not everyone in medieval Europe was poor, starving, and struggling to survive. We often imagine a peasant-filled world with barely enough to go around, but the reality is the medieval economy was much more diverse than we often imagine. There were wealthy merchants, prosperous farmers, and skilled craftsmen who enjoyed a decent standard of living. Think about it. Someone had to make those beautiful, illuminated manuscripts, craft those intricate pieces of jewelry, and build those impressive cathedrals. Medieval people ate more than just bread and gruel. There were feasts with roasted meats, fruits, and even spices for those who could afford them. Trade routes brought goods from far-off lands, adding variety and flavor to the medieval diet. While it's true that the poor did struggle, and there were periods of famine and hardship, medieval society was much more layered. There were different social classes, different occupations, and different levels of wealth. The term Dark Ages makes it sound like the medieval period was a time of intellectual stagnation, but this couldn't be further from the truth. There were significant developments in art, science, and literature throughout the Middle Ages. Monasteries became centers of learning, preserving, and copying ancient texts. The university system began to take shape, with institutions like the University of Bologna and the University of Paris. Philosophers like Thomas Aquinas and William of Ockham made major contributions to theology and logic. The Dark Ages were, in fact, a time of cultural and intellectual growth. You might associate witch hunts with the Middle Ages, picturing cackling figures being burned at the stake while superstitious villagers look on in fear. But the truth is, they didn't become widespread until the Renaissance and early modern period. During the medieval period, the church actually discouraged belief in witchcraft and magic. They saw it as superstitious nonsense, a distraction from the true faith. While there were instances of people being accused of witchcraft, it wasn't the widespread organized persecution that we see later on. It wasn't until the 15th and 16th centuries, during the time of the Reformation and religious upheaval, that the infamous witch trials became common. The printing press played a role in spreading fear and paranoia, and accusations of witchcraft became a way to target individuals, often women, who didn't conform to societal norms. The idea that medieval people were obsessed with witches is a myth. It's often said that medieval people were uneducated and illiterate, and while it's true that literacy rates were lower than they are today, particularly among peasants, education was valued in many parts of society. Monks and priests, as we've already discussed, were literate, and they played a vital role in preserving and transmitting knowledge. They weren't just holed up in monasteries, they taught in schools, advised rulers, and engaged in intellectual pursuits. Universities, which began forming in the 12th century, taught theology, medicine, and law, attracting students from all walks of life. These weren't just elite institutions. Scholarships and financial aid were available, allowing even those from humble backgrounds to pursue an education. By the late medieval period, even townspeople were learning to read, and books became more widely available due to the invention of the printing press. This led to a surge in literacy and a greater thirst for knowledge. Medieval torture devices like the Iron Maiden and the rack are infamous, often appearing in movies and TV shows as symbols of a brutal and barbaric era. But the reality is that torture wasn't as common as we might think. While it was used in some cases, it was generally reserved for the most serious crimes like treason or murder, and was regulated by laws. It wasn't a free-for-all of pain and suffering. In fact, many of the most horrific torture devices we associate with the medieval period weren't widely used until later. The Iron Maiden, for example, is likely a 19th century invention, a product of anti-medieval sentiment rather than historical reality. While justice was harsh by modern standards, with punishments like public floggings and executions, torture wasn't an everyday occurrence in medieval society. It's often said that people in the Middle Ages only lived to be 30 or 40 years old, that disease, famine, and warfare made for a short and brutal life. While it's true that average life expectancy was lower due to high infant mortality rates, those who survived childhood often lived into their 60s or 70s. Life was hard, with challenges and hardships that we can hardly imagine today, but people were resilient, and they found ways to thrive. Medieval medicine, while not as advanced as it is today, wasn't as primitive as we often imagine. There were hospitals, surgeries, and herbal remedies that people used to treat illness and injuries. Physicians studied ancient texts, developed new treatments, and played a vital role in their communities. They understood the importance of hygiene, even if their methods were different from ours. So there you have it, 10 of the most common medieval misconceptions, debunked. From the flat earth myth to the real lives of knights, the Middle Ages were a lot more complex than we've been led to believe. Hopefully, today's video helped clear up some of those lingering myths and gave you a better understanding of what life was really like back then. It was a time of innovation, creativity, and yes, even fun. If you enjoyed this video and want more history debunking content, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell to stay updated with all our future uploads. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.